The Enigmatic Lotus. Chapter 1, The Sacred Lotus. The evening air in Hampi was thick with the scent of jasmine and sandalwood, the faint hum of temple bells echoing across the sacred city. Inside the grand temple, a soft glow of oil lamps danced along the stone pillars, casting long shadows upon the intricate carvings of gods and legends. The temple's vast courtyard, usually a place of prayer and ritual, was quiet now, save for the graceful movements of a single dancer. Anaya stood at the center of the temple's sanctum, her bare feet brushing the cold marble floor. The rhythm of her movements, practiced and perfect, was accompanied only by the soft strumming of a sitar, played by a priest in the shadows. Her body swayed with the music, her long dark hair pulled back into a simple braid, leaving her elegant neck exposed. Her silken sari, in shades of deep blue and gold, shimmered with every step she took, as though she were a goddess incarnate. The dance she performed was ancient, one handed down through the generations of temple dancers known as devadasis who had devoted their lives to serving the gods. It was not just a performance, it was a prayer, a call to the divine to bless the land with prosperity and peace. But for Anaya, it was something more, an escape. The rhythm of her movements allowed her to forget the questions that constantly plagued her mind, questions she dared not ask aloud. Why had she been left at the temple gates as a child, with no memory of her family? What secret did her past hold? The elderly priestess who had raised her had always been gentle but distant, never speaking of Anaya's origins, as if they were a tale not meant to be told. All Anaya knew was that she was tied to the temple, her dance an offering to the gods, and that her future would forever be bound by the stone walls of Hampi. As her dance reached its crescendo, Anaya felt a shiver run through her, a subtle premonition of something beyond the temple's walls, something ancient. She paused, holding the final pose, her hands outstretched toward the heavens. The soft murmur of the wind outside carried with it the first hints of a coming storm. The priestess, sitting nearby with her eyes closed, murmured a blessing under her breath. "Anaya," she called, her voice soft but firm. "It is time." Anaya's heart quickened. She knew the moment had arrived. The prophecy. The priestess rose slowly, her gnarled hands gripping the wooden staff that had been with her for decades. Her eyes, though clouded with age, sparkled with an unsettling light. "The lotus will bloom tonight," she said, her voice low. "It has chosen you, child." Anaya's breath caught in her throat. The sacred lotus. The object of so many whispered tales. The flower that had been the subject of prophecy for generations, a symbol of the divine, of change, of fate itself. No one had seen it bloom in living memory, and few believed it truly existed. But for Anaya, the legend had always been more than myth. She had heard the stories in her childhood, passed from one temple dancer to the next like a secret, passed down like an oath. The prophecy spoke of the moonlit lotus, a flower that would bloom under the full moon, its petals glowing with an ethereal light. It was said that the flower held the power to change the course of history, to shift the fate of kings and empires. But the prophecy also spoke of a union, a pairing that would unlock the lotus's power, two souls, one of a warrior and one of a dancer, whose bond would determine the future of the empire. Anaya's heart raced. The gods had chosen her, but what did it mean for her future? And more importantly, who was the warrior who would come to fulfill his part in this prophecy? As though summoned by her thoughts, the sound of hooves echoed in the distance. She could not see him yet, but she felt his presence, a warrior who, like her, was bound to the sacred flower, though he had no knowledge of it. The priestess turned her gaze toward the door. "The prophecy cannot be avoided, Anaya. His arrival will change everything." "Who is he?" Anaya asked, her voice barely a whisper. The priestess smiled cryptically, a knowing look in her eyes. "You will know him when the time comes. But remember this, the lotus does not merely bloom for the taking. Its power demands sacrifice. And it will test your hearts in ways you cannot yet imagine." Anaya's mind swirled with questions, but before she could ask more, the temple's gates creaked open, revealing a man silhouetted against the night. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his armor glinting in the pale moonlight. His dark eyes, intense and focused, scanned the temple as if he were a hawk searching for its prey. The priestess nodded slowly. He is the one. Anaya's pulse quickened as she stepped forward, the fabric of her sari rustling softly with each movement. Her gaze met the warrior's, and for a fleeting moment, something in the air shifted. There was an undeniable pull, an electric tension between them, as though the prophecy had already begun to weave their fates together. The man, his face stern and unreadable, walked toward her, his footsteps steady and measured. But it was the look in his eyes, the gaze that held both curiosity and something deeper, that made Anaya's breath hitch. It was as though he, too, had heard the whispers of fate, and had come to fulfill his part in the prophecy. "Are you the one who has been chosen to guard the lotus?" the warrior asked, his voice rough, yet carrying an undertone of authority. Anaya nodded, her voice soft yet steady. "I am Anaya. And you are the warrior the prophecy spoke of." For a moment, silence enveloped them, the weight of the sacred words hanging in the air. The moon above bathed the temple in silver light, and in that moment, as the lotus began to bloom in the distance, Anaya realized that everything she had known was about to change. And she would never be the same again. Chapter 2, The Warrior, Arjun. The moon hung heavy in the sky, its light spilling like liquid silver across the landscape. Arjun, a man of few words and even fewer expressions, stood at the edge of the temple's outer courtyard. His dark, battle-worn armor gleamed faintly in the moonlight, the scars of countless battles etched into the metal. His chest rose and fell in steady breaths, though his mind raced with questions that had no easy answers. Who was this woman? The temple dancer, Anaya. Her presence was like a ripple across still water, subtle, yet impossible to ignore. When their eyes met, he had felt an undeniable shift, something ancient and powerful stirring in the air between them. He had come to the temple, summoned by the king's orders, to investigate rumors of a prophecy tied to the sacred lotus. But he hadn't expected to find her. A rustle behind him broke his thoughts. He turned to find the temple priestess approaching, her feet light on the stone, her robes flowing around her like a river of dark silk. She was old, her hair as white as snow, but her eyes were sharp, keen, as though she had seen more in her years than any man could fathom. "You've met her," the priestess said, her voice carrying a knowing tone that made Arjun uneasy. "Anaya," Arjun replied, his voice betraying none of the confusion he felt. "She is the one the prophecy speaks of." The priestess nodded slowly. "Yes. She is the temple dancer chosen by fate to play her part in the prophecy. And you, Arjun, are the warrior who has been chosen to fulfill yours." Arjun's brow furrowed. The prophecy, a tale whispered in dark corners of the court, was one that made little sense to him. It spoke of a sacred lotus, an artifact of unimaginable power that would rise under the full moon. And in its bloom, the fate of the empire would be decided. But it was not just the lotus that held significance, it was the union between a warrior and a dancer that would unlock its power. The priestess's gaze hardened as she studied him. "You doubt it, don't you?" Arjun's lips pressed into a thin line. "I have seen many things in my life, but I have never believed in fate, priestess. I have seen too much blood spilled in battle, too many lives lost to the whims of gods and kings. I don't believe in such tales." The priestess's expression softened, as if she had expected his response. "Fate has a way of showing itself when you least expect it. You were sent here for a reason, Arjun. And Anaya, she was waiting for you." Arjun didn't respond. Instead, he glanced back at the temple, where Anaya had vanished into the shadows. The connection between them was palpable, something he couldn't shake, though he wanted to. But he could not ignore the pull, the undeniable force that seemed to draw him toward her. "The lotus," Arjun said after a long pause. "What is its true power?" The priestess turned her gaze toward the heavens, her eyes distant as if seeing something far beyond the temple walls. The lotus is not just a flower. It is a symbol of transformation, of rebirth. When it blooms, the one who unlocks its power will be granted the ability to change the course of history. But such power comes at a cost, Arjun. It is a power not to be taken lightly. The wind stirred, lifting the edges of her robes as she continued. The prophecy speaks of a warrior and a dancer who will be drawn together. Together, they must protect the lotus from those who would seek to wield its power for their own selfish gain. Arjun's jaw tightened. And if I fail? Then all is lost, the priestess said, her voice carrying a heavy weight. The empire will fall. The bloodshed that has plagued these lands will return tenfold, and nothing will be left but ashes. Silence settled over them, thick with the gravity of her words. Arjun turned away from the priestess, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the faintest glimmer of the lotus could be seen, rising like a beacon in the distance. It was still far away, but its pull seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment. The fate of the empire rested on the fulfillment of a prophecy he didn't believe in, and yet, he could not deny the truth of the strange bond between him and Anaya. Later that evening, after the priestess had left, Arjun made his way back to the temple, his thoughts still turbulent. He needed answers, needed to understand why he felt so drawn to a woman he barely knew. He had fought in wars, faced death countless times, but nothing had ever unsettled him quite like this. As he approached the entrance, he was stopped by one of the temple attendants, a young woman who spoke softly but urgently. "Warrior, the temple dancer wishes to speak with you," she said, her eyes wide with curiosity. Arjun's brow furrowed. He had not expected Anaya to seek him out so soon. The pull between them had been undeniable, but he didn't know what to make of it. Was it the prophecy at work? Or was it something else entirely? He nodded curtly and followed the attendant into the heart of the temple, where the flickering lamplight revealed the graceful figure of Anaya, standing alone by the sacred lotus pool. The moon above bathed her in a soft glow, turning her into a vision of ethereal beauty. She did not look at him as he approached, her gaze fixed on the shimmering waters of the lotus pool. For a long moment, there was only the sound of their breathing and the distant hum of temple bells. Then, Anaya spoke, her voice low but steady. "You are the warrior," she said, not a question but a statement. "I feel it in my bones. The prophecy is real, isn't it?" Arjun hesitated. The uncertainty in her voice mirrored his own, yet he could not bring himself to lie. "It is." Her eyes met his, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause. The connection between them was undeniable, as if some invisible thread had tethered their fates together. "We cannot fight it, can we?" she asked softly. "No," Arjun answered, his voice rough. "We can't." Anaya's lips trembled as if struggling to keep her composure. "Then we must face it together, whatever it may bring." Arjun nodded, his heart heavier than it had ever been. The path ahead would not be easy, but one thing was certain, the sacred lotus had already begun to change their lives, and the future of the empire was now tied to the destiny of a warrior and a dancer. Chapter 3, The Enigmatic Lotus. The days that followed the fateful meeting by the lotus pool were filled with tension and uncertainty. Arjun had never believed in destiny, yet everything around him now seemed to whisper of forces far beyond his understanding. The prophecy, the sacred lotus, and the connection between himself and Anaya, the pieces of the puzzle were slowly falling into place, but the picture they formed was one he wasn't sure he could accept. Anaya, too, felt the weight of the prophecy on her shoulders. The days she spent in the temple had always been filled with devotion, her dance a sacred offering to the gods, but now, with Arjun at her side, nothing seemed certain anymore. The temple had been her sanctuary, a place where she could lose herself in the rhythms of her dance, away from the haunting questions of her past. But now, the future beckoned with a force she couldn't ignore, a future she had no choice but to walk into, whether she was ready or not. One evening, as the full moon rose high above the temple, Anaya stood by the lotus pool once more, her bare feet cool against the stone. The lotus flowers were now in full bloom, their delicate petals glistening under the moon's radiant light. She could feel their power in the air, a pulse, a hum that seemed to resonate deep within her. Arjun approached from behind, his heavy footsteps barely audible on the stone. His presence was commanding, but there was an unease about him that mirrored her own. She did not turn to face him immediately, instead gazing at the lotus, its blossoms glowing like stars. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "It is," Arjun replied, his voice soft, almost reverent. He stood beside her, his gaze following hers to the lotus flowers. "But it is also dangerous." Anaya finally turned to face him, her dark eyes searching his face for something in answer, perhaps, to the growing tension between them. "Do you truly believe that? That the lotus is dangerous?" Arjun met her gaze, his jaw tightening. "The power it holds, it's more than just a symbol. It's something that can change the fate of entire kingdoms. It can save or destroy." Anaya lowered her gaze, her fingers brushing the petals of a nearby lotus. "And you think it could destroy us? Destroy everything we've built?" He shook his head, though his expression remained serious. "I don't know. But I've seen enough bloodshed in my life to know that power like this doesn't come without a cost. And I fear the cost may be too high." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. There was a danger, yes, but there was also a pull that neither of them could deny. Anaya had always known that the temple held secrets, ancient ones tied to her, but now, with the blooming lotus and the prophecy unfolding, the truth was slowly beginning to surface. "I don't know what to do with this power," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never asked for it. I never asked for any of this." Arjun's eyes softened, though the conflict within him was clear. "None of us ask for the burdens we're given," he said, stepping closer. "But we can choose what to do with them." She looked up at him then, meeting his eyes with an intensity that matched his own. "And what do you choose, Arjun? To fight it? To run from it?" "I don't know," he admitted. "But I choose to protect you, Anaya. That much I know for certain." The air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken words. She took a breath, her heart racing, but before she could respond, the distant sound of drums echoed through the temple grounds. It was a familiar sound, one that had always been part of the rhythm of the temple's rituals. But tonight, the drums were louder, faster, and filled with an urgency that sent a ripple of unease through Anaya. "What is that?" she asked, her voice tense. Arjun's expression darkened. "Trouble." Before she could ask more, a figure appeared at the temple's entrance dressed in the royal guard's uniform, his face grim. "Warrior Arjun," the man called, his voice urgent. "You are needed at once. The king has received word of an impending invasion. The lotus is more than just a symbol, it has become a target." The night became a blur of preparations and hurried movements. Arjun and Anaya stood together in the courtyard, surrounded by the royal guard. The drums had stopped, but the sense of impending danger had only grown stronger. Arjun's thoughts raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. The prophecy had not foreseen this, an enemy attack in the middle of the night. Had they learned of the lotus? Did they know of its power? "We need to move, now," Arjun said, his voice low but filled with urgency. He turned to face Anaya, his eyes searching hers. "You're safer within the temple's inner sanctum. Stay there until I return." But Anaya didn't move. She stood firm, her expression resolute. "I'm not hiding while you fight for the empire, Arjun. This is my destiny as much as it is yours." He opened his mouth to protest, but she held up a hand, silencing him. "I will go with you." There was no time for further discussion. Without another word, they set out together, Arjun leading the way with Anaya close behind. They passed through the temple's gates and into the streets of Hampi, where the sounds of the royal army's preparations filled the air. The tension in the city was palpable, as soldiers and citizens alike prepared for the worst. Arjun's thoughts remained on the lotus. It was no longer just a legend. The power it held was real, and someone, perhaps many, would seek to control it. He had sworn to protect Anaya, but he had never anticipated this. A battle over the future of the empire, and the only key to that future was a flower blooming under the moonlight. As they reached the royal encampment, the gates swung open, and the king's emissary rushed toward them, his face pale. "The enemy comes from the north," he said. "And they are not alone. They have allies, dark forces who seek the lotus for their own." Arjun's hand tightened on his sword hilt. "We will stop them," he vowed. But inside, he felt a pang of doubt. The lotus's power was a magnet for greed, and he feared it would destroy them all. Anaya, standing beside him, met his gaze. Her eyes were filled with the same determination, the same resolve. "The lotus will not fall into the wrong hands," she said, her voice steady. "We will protect it. Together." And so, with the full moon overhead and the sacred lotus blooming as a beacon of hope and danger, Arjun and Anaya stepped into the heart of the empire's greatest battle yet. Chapter 4, Shadows of the Past. The royal camp was bustling with the frantic preparations of war, but amidst the tension, the sight of the lotus in full bloom seemed to make the night feel eerily calm. The moon above was a constant reminder of the prophecy and its unfolding events. Arjun's thoughts were a whirlwind as he walked beside Anaya, her presence both a comfort and a reminder of the monumental task ahead. As they approached the king's tent, Arjun couldn't shake the feeling that the danger wasn't just from the enemy army. There were whispers in the wind, threats that felt as ancient as the temple walls. Anaya seemed to sense it too, her gaze drifting toward the distant mountains that marked the northern border, where their enemies were gathering. The king's emissary, who had been waiting outside, gestured for them to enter. Arjun's hand instinctively rested on the hilt of his sword, his muscles tense with the anticipation of what lay ahead. Inside the king's tent, the atmosphere was thick with the urgency of the situation. King Krishnadevaraja, the ruler of the Vijayanagara Empire, sat at the head of a large table, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. The map before him detailed the movements of the enemy forces, an alliance of northern kingdoms that had long coveted the wealth and power of the southern empire. But the map was not what held Arjun's attention. It was the man standing at the king's side. A warrior, tall and regal, his armor adorned with intricate patterns of gold and silver, standing with the grace of someone who was no stranger to power. His piercing gaze shifted toward Arjun, his eyes sharp, calculating, and filled with something Arjun couldn't quite place. Recognition flickered in his chest, though he was sure they had never met. There was something unsettling about him, a quiet authority that set him apart from the other men in the tent. "Ah, Arjun, you've arrived," King Krishnadevaraja said, his voice gruff but welcoming. "I trust you've met General Veera." Arjun gave a stiff nod, his gaze lingering on the general for a moment longer than necessary. "I have," he replied, his tone neutral. Anaya, standing beside him, studied General Veera with equal scrutiny, though her expression was carefully composed. She could feel something shift in the air when Veera's gaze met hers, a spark of recognition that seemed to pass between them, though neither spoke a word. It was as though the prophecy had not only brought Arjun into her life, but had also stirred something deep within her that she hadn't yet fully understood. Veera's eyes lingered on Anaya for a moment before he addressed Arjun, his voice low and measured. "The situation is dire. The enemy is closing in, and they are not only warriors. They have learned of the lotus, and they will stop at nothing to seize its power." "How did they find out?" Arjun's question was blunt, his hand still resting on his sword. The king's voice cut through the tension. "Our spies have informed us that there are those within the empire who would betray us for the promise of power. The lotus is not just a symbol, it's a weapon, and there are those who would use it to rewrite the fate of our lands." Anaya's heart quickened at the mention of betrayal. She had always known that the lotus was powerful, but hearing it spoken of as a weapon made her blood run cold. Her past had always been shrouded in mystery, and now she felt as though she were a pawn in a larger game, one that she had no control over. Veera stepped forward, his expression grim. There is no time to waste. We must act quickly. The Northern Alliance moves swiftly, and if we do not stop them, they will have the Lotus and all that comes with it. Arjun looked at the map, his mind already calculating the next move. We will not let them take it. Anaya turned her gaze toward him, her eyes searching his face. But how can we stop them? She asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. There are too many, and they have the advantage of surprise. With your help, General Veera said, his voice calm but firm. The Lotus cannot be controlled by brute force alone. Its power lies in its bond with you, Anaya. Only you can unlock its full potential. The prophecy speaks of a union between you and a warrior, a protector who will ensure that the Lotus is not used for destruction. Anaya's breath caught in her throat. She had always known that the Lotus was tied to her, but she had never understood the full extent of its power or the responsibility it placed on her shoulders. Could she truly control it? Could she be the key to saving the Empire? Her gaze flickered to Arjun, the man who had become more than just a protector in her eyes. His strength, his resolve, they were undeniable. But the power of the Lotus was something neither of them had fully understood. The union they had forged, however destined, was untested, and now, with an entire empire's future hanging in the balance, doubt crept into her heart. We don't have time for uncertainty, King Krishnadevaraja interjected, his voice authoritative. Arjun, Anaya, you must go to the temple at once. It is the only place where the Lotus's true power can be revealed. We will hold the line here, but we need you to unlock its potential before it is too late. Anaya nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. We'll go immediately. As they turned to leave the tent, Arjun placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch grounding her in the midst of the chaos. We'll face this together, Anaya. Whatever happens, we will protect the Lotus. We will protect each other. But as they left the king's camp, Arjun couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The enemy was not the only threat they faced. There were shadows in their midst, dark forces that sought the Lotus for reasons far more sinister than power. Anaya felt it too. The closer they got to the temple, the heavier the air became, as if the very ground beneath their feet held secrets that they were not yet ready to uncover. As they entered the temple, the moonlight filtered through the high arches, casting long shadows across the stone floor. The Lotus, still blooming brightly, seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. Arjun turned to Anaya, his voice low and urgent. Anaya, are you sure you're ready for this? Once the Lotus's power is unlocked, there's no turning back. It will change everything. She looked at him, her eyes steady. I don't know if I'm ready. But I have no choice. The words hung in the air as they approached the sacred lotus. Anaya reached out slowly, her fingers brushing the edge of its glowing petals. The moment she made contact, a surge of energy coursed through her, sharp and overwhelming. For a fleeting moment, she saw visions, flashes of her past, her forgotten lineage, and a destiny she had never fully understood. Then, a voice echoed in her mind, ancient and filled with power. The lotus blooms for those who are destined to wield it. But beware, for the path ahead is fraught with peril. Trust in your bond, for it is the key to survival. Anaya gasped, pulling her hand back. She turned to Arjun, her breath shallow, her mind spinning with the revelations that had just flooded her consciousness. Arjun, she whispered, I remember. I know who I am. Chapter 5, The Revelation of Blood and Fate. The silence in the temple was profound, the stillness of the sacred space only broken by the gentle rustle of the lotus petals as they bloomed further under Anaya's touch. But Anaya's heart pounded in her chest, the energy coursing through her like a wildfire, too intense to ignore. The vision had been brief, but in those fleeting moments, everything she thought she knew about herself had shattered. I remember, she whispered again, her voice trembling. I remember everything. Arjun took a step closer, his brow furrowed with concern. What do you mean? What did you see? Anaya turned to face him, her hands trembling as they rested on her chest. The weight of the revelation was heavy, crushing even, yet there was something freeing about it. She had spent years unaware, searching for answers that had always seemed just out of reach. Now, they were before her, clear and undeniable. I am not just a temple dancer, Arjun, she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. I am the daughter of the temple's ancient priestess, a bloodline tied to the lotus, to its true power. The gods themselves chose our family to protect it. I have always been part of something much bigger than I ever knew. Arjun stood there for a moment, stunned by her words. The revelation hit him like a thunderclap. He had always known there was more to Anaya than met the eye, but he never could have guessed the truth. Her connection to the lotus was not just a symbolic one, it was rooted in her bloodline, in her very essence. But why did you not know? Arjun asked, his voice rough with disbelief. How could you not know this? Anaya's eyes fell to the ground. I was kept in the dark. My mother, she sealed the truth from me. She knew that I would not be able to bear the weight of it all, so she protected me, hiding me away in the temple. But the truth never stays hidden forever. Her words hung in the air, thick with a sorrow that Arjun could feel in his bones. He wanted to comfort her, to tell her that it would all be okay. But he knew the gravity of what she was saying. The power of the lotus wasn't just a gift, it was a burden, one that would demand everything from her. He stepped forward, his hand reaching out to gently touch her arm. Anaya, you don't have to carry this alone. She lifted her gaze, her eyes fierce with newfound clarity. I never asked for this, Arjun. I never wanted to be the one to wield the lotus's power. But the truth is clear now, we cannot escape it. The prophecy has always been about me. It was never just a choice, it was my fate. Arjun's heart twisted with a mix of admiration and fear. She was strong, stronger than he had ever known. But this path, this destiny was fraught with peril, and he could not bear the thought of losing her to it. You're not alone, Anaya, he said again, his voice firm. I will be by your side. I will protect you, no matter what happens. She nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude, but there was a shadow of doubt that lingered in her gaze. I hope that's enough. The lotus's power is too great for any one person to control. The visions I saw, they spoke of a union, a bond that would be our salvation. But there's more, Arjun. The lotus is not only a weapon of light. It has a darker side. And the enemies who seek it, they will stop at nothing to claim it. As she spoke, Arjun could feel the weight of her words settle over them like an invisible shroud. The prophecy spoke of a bond between a warrior and a dancer, but it was not just the power of their union that would save the empire, it was their ability to navigate the darkness that came with the lotus. He knew that Anaya had not just been chosen because of her bloodline, but because of her heart, her unwavering resolve. But the darker side of the lotus, the part that could undo everything, was something neither of them could ignore. He turned his gaze toward the lotus again, its petals now glowing with an otherworldly radiance. The power it held was undeniable, but as Anaya had said, it was not just a force for good. It was a force that could destroy as easily as it could create. We must unlock its power fully, Arjun said, his voice filled with determination. Only then will we understand what we're truly up against. Anaya nodded slowly, though a flicker of hesitation remained in her eyes. But unlocking it will come with consequences. I'm not sure I'm ready for that. Before Arjun could respond, a loud crash echoed from the temple entrance, followed by the unmistakable sound of armored footsteps. Without warning, the heavy wooden doors of the temple were thrown open, and armed soldiers poured into the sacred space. Anaya! A voice shouted, one that made Arjun's blood run cold. It was Veera. The general stood at the head of a small contingent of soldiers, his armor gleaming in the moonlight. His eyes locked onto Anaya with a strange intensity, and Arjun could see the subtle shift in his demeanor as he took in the sight of her standing by the lotus. General Veera, Anaya said, her voice calm but wary. What is this? What are you doing here? Vira's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. I have come for the lotus, Anaya. And I have come to claim what is rightfully mine. Arjun's hand tightened around the hilt of his sword, his pulse quickening. You speak treason, Vira. The lotus belongs to the Empire. You have no claim over it. Vira's smile deepened, and he took a step forward, his hand resting on the sword at his side. I have no claim over it. You underestimate me, Arjun. The Empire has been blind to the true power of the lotus, but I have known its value for years. You, too, are part of this, aren't you? You, the chosen warrior, the one destined to protect it. But in the end, it's not about protecting the lotus, it's about wielding its power. Anaya's heart sank as she realized the truth of his words. Vira had not come to protect the lotus, he had come to control it, to use it to shape the empire in his own image. The prophecy, the bond between her and Arjun, it had all been a carefully crafted ruse to get her to unlock the lotus's power, and now he was prepared to take it for himself. Arjun's eyes flashed with fury. You would betray the very empire you serve. Vira chuckled darkly. Betrayal is only a matter of perspective, Arjun. You will see soon enough. The lotus will be mine, and with it, the empire will fall under my rule. Before Arjun could react, Vira signaled his men, and they moved in with deadly precision. But Anaya, standing resolute beside Arjun, stepped forward, her hand outstretched toward the glowing lotus. No, she said, her voice filled with a quiet power. You will not have it. The air around them seemed to shimmer, and the lotus responded to her command. Its petals pulsed with an intense light, and a wave of energy swept through the temple, knocking Vira's soldiers off their feet. Anaya's body trembled with the effort of controlling the power, but she stood firm. This is not yours to take, Vira. You cannot control it. You cannot control me. Vira's expression shifted from arrogance to fury, but before he could respond, the ground beneath them rumbled, a low, ominous sound that echoed from deep within the earth. The temple walls seemed to shake, and a dark, swirling mist began to rise around them, seeping from the very stones. The lotus had awoken fully, and so had the darkness within it. Chapter 6, The Dark Awakening. The temple trembled, its ancient stones groaning as if they were alive, caught in the throes of a struggle far older than anything Anaya or Arjun could comprehend. The lotus at the center of the sacred space pulsed with a brilliant, almost blinding light, but it was the shadows that encroached upon them rising from the ground like smoke that chilled them to their very bones. Vira stumbled back, his soldiers reeling from the surge of energy that had knocked them off their feet. But the general, unfazed by the chaotic shift, regained his composure quickly. His eyes, however, narrowed with something far more dangerous than mere anger. So it begins, he murmured, his voice laced with both anticipation and regret. Anaya's heart thudded in her chest as she focused on the lotus, its power coursing through her in waves. She could feel it, the ancient magic that had been dormant for so long, stirring now within the temple, yearning to be set free. But with its awakening came something darker, something she had only glimpsed in the fragmented visions that had flooded her mind earlier. The swirling mist thickened, darkening the edges of the temple. It seemed alive, crawling along the ground like tendrils of shadow reaching toward them, seeking to pull them into an abyss that was far beyond their understanding. We have to stop this, Arjun said, his voice urgent, his eyes locked on the swirling dark mist. Anaya's breath was shallow as she turned to him. I can feel it, Arjun. The lotus, it's not just a force of creation. It holds a darkness that can unravel everything. Then we need to contain it before it consumes us all, Arjun said, stepping closer, ready to shield her from whatever danger was closing in. But as he moved toward her, the shadows seemed to respond, twisting violently around the pair, pushing them back as though trying to keep them apart. A chill swept over the temple, and the lotus's light flickered, as if unsure of its own power. Anaya closed her eyes, her fingers trembling as she reached toward the lotus once more. This time, she concentrated on the connection that had awakened within her, the pulse of magic that flowed between her and the flower. The bond between them, the union foretold by the prophecy, was her only chance. She could feel the presence of the ancient spirits, guardians of the lotus, pushing at the edges of her consciousness. She forced herself to focus, to center her thoughts. "Hear me," she whispered silently, her voice barely a breath, but filled with the power of her resolve. "I am the guardian, the protector. Let me wield your power for good." A deep, resonant voice echoed within her mind, ancient and filled with sorrow. "The lotus is not merely a weapon, child of the temple. It is a choice. A choice to embrace light or darkness. And you will face the cost of your decision." Anaya shuddered as the weight of the words settled upon her. The power of the lotus was not something to be taken lightly. It had its price, and the path she walked now could lead her either to salvation or to destruction. The shadows writhed around her, closing in, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. But Anaya, holding tightly to the light of the lotus, forced herself to stand firm. "Anaya!" Arjun's voice broke through the chaos, urgent and filled with fear. "Don't let it control you." She turned to face him, her eyes wide, filled with the overwhelming storm of emotions she could hardly contain. "I'm trying, Arjun, but I don't know if I can stop it. The lotus, it's trying to claim me." Vira, seeing the chaos unfolding, stepped forward again, his eyes alight with something darker than ambition. "You think you can control it, Anaya?" His voice was dripping with disdain. "You don't understand. You never did. The lotus was never meant for anyone to control. It was meant to be wielded. And I, unlike you, understand its true power." He raised his hand, and the dark mist responded, swirling toward him, twisting around his fingers like smoke. Arjun's sword was in his hand now, gleaming in the dim light, but he knew that even his strength might not be enough against Vira's growing command over the shadows. "No!" Anaya cried out, her voice desperate as the dark mist closed in around them. She reached out again to the lotus, her fingers trembling as they brushed its glowing petals. But this time, the lotus did not respond with the warmth of the light it had once given her. Instead, it felt cold, as if it, too, was trapped between two opposing forces, light and shadow. The voice returned, its ancient resonance filling her mind. "The lotus does not choose sides, Anaya. It is the one who calls to it who shapes its fate. You cannot choose light without accepting the darkness that lies within you. You must unite the two or destroy both." Anaya's breath caught in her throat as the full weight of the prophecy settled upon her. She was not simply a protector of the lotus. She was its keeper, its balance, and only by understanding both the light and the darkness could she ever hope to wield its power without destroying everything. Vera laughed, a low, menacing sound. "You cannot control both. You will fail. The lotus will fall into my hands, and with it, the empire will be mine." But Anaya, her heart now clear in its purpose, stepped forward, her hand held high to the lotus. "No," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I will not let you use it. The lotus belongs to the people, not to one man's ambition." The dark mist swirled around her, but now, instead of repelling it, she drew it toward her, embracing the shadows as much as the light. She was the bridge between both worlds, and if she was to fulfill the prophecy, she needed to understand the balance between the two. The lotus responded, its light flaring brighter than before, but now it shimmered with streaks of shadow, creating a brilliant and terrifying fusion of both powers. The ground beneath them cracked, and the very air seemed to pulse with energy. Vera lunged toward her, but Arjun, with his quick reflexes, blocked his path, sword raised to meet the general's own. "Not today, Vera," Arjun said, his voice low and steady. "You won't claim the lotus. Not while I'm still here." Anaya turned her focus back to the lotus, calling out to its power. "I will not be afraid of what I must wield," she declared, her voice strong now, no longer trembling. I will stand between light and darkness, and I will protect the empire that depends on it. The shadows hesitated. For a moment, everything seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a force that sent ripples of energy through the temple, the lotus erupted in a burst of light and shadow, throwing both Vira and his soldiers backward, knocking them to the ground. The dark mist receded, dissipating like smoke in the wind. The temple was silent once more, save for the distant sound of the wind outside. Anaya stood, breathless but unbroken, the lotus's light now steady and calm, like a heartbeat that had once been erratic but was now grounded in understanding. Vira is not the only one with ambition, she said softly, turning to Arjun, who was watching her with awe. But I will not let his darkness define me. She had chosen to wield the lotus, to accept both the light and the darkness within her. And now, the fate of the empire rested on the strength of that choice.